The rain poured down heavily that evening, beating against the pavement like an endless reminder of sorrow. Emma hurried through the streets, clutching her umbrella, feeling the chill seep into her bones. She worked late at the shelter that night, her heart heavy with the faces she couldn't forget. But it was the man in the corner, Mike, who stayed on her mind. He'd been coming around for weeks now, silent, withdrawn, and always watching the world with a distant gaze, like he had been left behind. Something about him stirred an unease within her, a curiosity she couldn't shake. He looked different from the others. While most sought comfort, warmth, or someone to talk to, Mike didn't seem to need any of that. He would just sit there, staring through the windows, as if searching for something he'd lost long ago. His face was worn, marked by time and something darker, something he wouldn't reveal. That evening, as the shelter doors closed, she noticed Mike still there, huddled in the same corner as always. He didn't ask for anything, didn't move, as if he expected nothing from anyone. "Mike?" she called softly, approaching him. "Do you need anything before I leave?" For a moment, there was only silence. Then slowly he turned to face her, eyes hollow but deep with a history she couldn't fathom. "No, thank you," he muttered, his voice hoarse, as though he hadn't spoken in days. As Emma walked away, her mind raced. Who was he? Why did he always seem so lost, yet so determined to stay invisible? And that dog tag she noticed once around his neck. There was a name, but she couldn't quite make it out. Later that night, lying in bed, Emma couldn't stop thinking about it. Her father, a veteran himself, often spoke of those who came back from war but never truly returned. The ones who couldn't adjust, who carried the invisible scars of battles long ended. Something about Mike fit that description. He wasn't just homeless, he was broken, carrying a weight so heavy it had dragged him into the shadows of society. But something else was bothering her. She had seen the dog tag again tonight, long enough to catch the name, Michael Johnson. The name rang a bell, but where from? The next day, Emma did something she never thought she would do. She sat at her desk, pulled out her laptop, and searched the name. What she found made her breath catch in her throat. Michael Johnson was the name of a war hero her father had spoken of many times, a man who had saved countless lives in one of the most brutal battles overseas, but was believed to have disappeared after the war. Her heart raced. Could it be? Could Mike, the man who now lived in the shadows, be the same Michael Johnson her father had admired for so long? The pieces didn't fit, or did they? There was only one way to find out. Emma decided to confront Mike, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. If he was the man from her father's stories, why had he let himself fall so far? Why hide from a world that once saw him as a hero? When she arrived at the shelter that evening, she found Mike sitting in his usual corner, staring into the void. She took a deep breath and approached him, this time more determined than ever. "Mike, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, her voice trembling with nerves. For a long moment, he didn't respond, but then he nodded, slowly lifting his tired eyes to meet hers. There was a weight in his gaze that Emma couldn't ignore. "I know who you are," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike's reaction was immediate. His eyes darkened, his body tensed. "You don't know anything!" He snapped, his voice rough, defensive. "But I do," she insisted, holding up her phone, showing him the article she had found about Michael Johnson. "You're him, aren't you? The soldier who saved all those lives. My father used to talk about you. He said you were a hero." For a moment, Mike froze. Then, with a hollow laugh, he shook his head. "A hero?" he muttered, almost bitterly. "Is that what they say?" The tension between them hung heavy in the air. Emma knew she was close to the truth. But there was something more, something Mike was hiding. And whatever it wasn't going to be easy to uncover. The shelter was quieter that evening, the hum of the rain outside the only sound filling the room. Emma sat across from Mike, her eyes locked on his, waiting for him to break the silence. The article still glowed on her phone, the headline catching the dim light of the room. "War hero vanishes after battle, presumed dead." But Mike wasn't dead. He was sitting right in front of her, very much alive, but hiding from the world he had once fought so hard to protect. The question that nagged at Emma, the one she couldn't shake, was why? Why had he let his life spiral so far? Why had he chosen to disappear? "Mike, I don't want to pressure you," Emma began gently, trying to ease the tension between them. "But I think you need to talk about it. Maybe I can help." His eyes flickered, a brief glint of pain crossing his face before he turned away again. He wasn't ready to let her in yet. Not fully. "I don't need help," he muttered. "I've survived this long on my own. I'll be fine." But Emma didn't believe him. She had seen too many people come through the shelter with that same look in their eyes. People who had fallen through the cracks, who had given up on themselves because they thought no one cared. But she cared, and she wasn't going to let Mike slip away like that. Not after everything she had discovered. The next morning, Emma sat in her kitchen staring at the cup of coffee in her hands. She had spent the entire night thinking about Mike, about the pain he was clearly hiding, and about her father. David, her father, had often spoken about the brotherhood of soldiers, the bond that was forged in the trenches, in the face of unimaginable danger. It was a bond that never broke, no matter how many years passed. She picked up her phone, her heart racing. She hadn't spoken to her father in a while, but if anyone could help her understand Mike's situation, it was him. The phone rang twice before her father's deep, familiar voice answered. "Emma, it's been a while." "Hey, Dad," she said, forcing a smile into her voice. "I need to talk to you about something." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence that felt heavier than usual. "What's going on?" her father asked, his tone cautious. "I met someone at the shelter," Emma said, hesitating for a moment. "A veteran. I think you might know him." Her father didn't respond immediately, but Emma could hear the shift in his breathing. "What's his name?" "Michael Johnson," she said softly. The silence that followed was so thick Emma could almost hear her father's thoughts racing. She could picture him, sitting at his kitchen table, brow furrowed, trying to piece together a past that had long been buried. "Michael Johnson?" he repeated, his voice barely above a whisper. "That's impossible. He's dead. He saved my life, but they told us he never made it out. They said he was killed in action." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. "He's not dead, Dad. He's here. I've been talking to him." Later that evening, David arrived at the shelter. His tall frame filled the doorway, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Mike. Emma watched as her father's face tightened, a wave of emotions crossing his features. He hadn't seen Mike in years, decades even. And yet, here he was, sitting in a corner like a ghost who had returned to the living. "Mike," David said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Mike looked up, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, the two men simply stared at each other, the weight of unspoken words filling the air between them. Finally, Mike broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come." But David shook his head. "No, you saved my life, and I've been searching for answers ever since. Why did you disappear? Why didn't you come home?" Mike sighed, rubbing his hands over his face. The years had worn him down, his once strong posture now slumped under the weight of a lifetime's worth of regrets. "I didn't come home because there was nothing left for me," Mike admitted, his voice hoarse. "When I came back, I didn't recognize the world anymore. The things I saw over there, I couldn't let go, and no one was waiting for me." That night, Emma sat between the two men, listening as Mike finally opened up about the horrors he had experienced, the friends he had lost, and the guilt that had haunted him every day since he returned from the war. He had been celebrated as a hero, but in his own mind, he was anything but. "They pinned medals on me and called me brave," Mike said, his voice trembling. "But what kind of man watches his friends die and does nothing to save them? I survived, but they didn't, and now I have to live with that." David reached across the table, his hand gripping Mike's shoulder. "You saved me," he said, his voice firm. "And that's something I will never forget. You have to stop blaming yourself. You did what you could." The next morning, Emma arrived at the shelter with an idea. She couldn't change Mike's past, but maybe, just maybe, she could help him find a new future. Her mind raced with possibilities, and she knew exactly where to start. She pulled up the number for a rehabilitation program specifically designed for veterans dealing with trauma. It wasn't just about housing, it was about giving them the tools to heal, to find their way back to the life they deserved. "Mike," she said gently, sitting beside him, "I know it feels like the world has forgotten you, but it hasn't. My father and we haven't. and there's a place that can help you if you're ready." Mike didn't respond at first. He stared down at his hands, his expression a mix of doubt and weariness. But Emma didn't give up. "I'm not asking you to do this for me," she continued. "Do it for yourself. You've spent too long running from the past. It's time to start living again." The air was thick with tension as Emma waited for Mike to respond. For a long time, he just sat there, staring at the paper she had placed in front of him. The name of the rehabilitation center was clear, almost glaring in the soft light of the shelter. But Mike didn't move. He didn't reach for it, didn't react. Emma's heart pounded in her chest, knowing this moment could go either way. She had seen it before, people too broken to accept help, too lost to believe in the possibility of healing. She held her breath, praying that Mike would be different. "I don't know if I can do this," Mike finally whispered, his voice low, almost as if he was talking to himself rather than Emma. "What if it's too late for me?" Before Emma could respond, David stepped forward. His voice was steady, but there was an urgency to it that hadn't been there before. "It's not too late, Mike. It's never too late." He sat down across from Mike, the two men facing each other, one fighting to pull the other back from the edge. "You think I haven't been through the same thing? You think I don't know what it's like to feel like you're the one who should have died out there?" David leaned forward, his eyes locked on Mike's. "But we didn't. We survived. And it's our job to make sure that counts for something." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emma felt her throat tighten as she watched the scene unfold, knowing how much this moment meant for both men. Mike shifted in his seat, his hands trembling slightly as he finally looked up at David. His eyes were hollow, but there was a flicker of something in them, something Emma hadn't seen before. "I've been dead for years," Mike muttered, shaking his head. "I don't even know how to live anymore." David stood, his presence commanding, as if the weight of his own experiences gave him the strength to lift Mike up. "Then we'll teach you. We'll remind you." Emma watched as her father placed a hand on Mike's shoulder, a gesture that seemed to break through the wall Mike had built around himself. The tension in Mike's body visibly lessened, his defenses crumbling under the weight of years of guilt and isolation. "Okay," Mike said, his voice barely audible. "I'll try." The first day at the rehabilitation center wasn't easy. Mike had been living on the streets for so long that the concept of routine, of stability, felt foreign to him. He moved through the halls like a shadow, avoiding eye contact with the other veterans. Each one had their own story, their own scars, but Mike couldn't bring himself to connect with them. Not yet. Emma visited every day, determined to be there for him through the process. She knew this wasn't going to be a quick fix, that it would take time for Mike to heal, but she could see the progress, even if he couldn't. One afternoon, she found Mike sitting alone in the garden, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant. She sat beside him, offering him a smile, though he didn't return it. "How are you feeling today?" she asked gently. Mike shrugged. "I don't know. It's hard. Everything feels different." "Different can be good," Emma replied. "You're doing something important here, Mike. You're giving yourself a chance." He didn't answer, but she could see the conflict in his eyes. He was struggling with something, and Emma had a feeling it wasn't just the adjustment to the center. Something deeper was weighing on him, something he hadn't yet shared. Later that evening, Emma received a call from the center's director. Her heart sank when she heard his voice. "Mike is in a bad place," the director said, his tone grim. "He's refusing to participate in the group sessions. I'm afraid he's slipping back into his old habits." Emma felt a rush of panic, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'll be right there." When she arrived, she found Mike in his room, sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He didn't look up when she entered, but she could feel the weight of his despair. "Mike, talk to me," she pleaded, sitting beside him. "Tell me what's going on." For a long moment, there was silence. Then, finally, Mike spoke, his voice raw with pain. "I can't stop thinking about them," he whispered. "The men who didn't make it. I keep seeing their faces, hearing their voices. They're dead because of me."
Hey there, quick message. Grab a paper, write down Herokind Stories, our channel name. Come back soon, we've got incredible stories you won't want to miss.
Emma felt her heart break for him. She had known he was carrying this burden, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch gentle but firm. "They're not dead because of you, Mike," she said softly. "You didn't make that decision. War did. It's not your fault." Mike shook his head, tears brimming in his eyes. "But it feels like it is. I can't let it go." The next day, David arrived at the center. Emma had called him, knowing that if anyone could reach Mike in this moment, it was him. David found Mike in the same place, his body slumped with the weight of his grief. But David wasn't going to let him sink any further. He stood in front of Mike, his voice strong, commanding. "You don't get to give up," David said, his tone firm. "Not after everything you've been through, not after you saved my life and countless others. You think they'd want you to waste the life they didn't get to have? You think they'd be okay with you giving up?" Mike looked up, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know how to live with it." "You don't have to live with it alone," David replied. "You have me. You have Emma. You have everyone in this place who understands what you've been through. We'll carry it together." In that moment, something shifted in Mike. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was a start. He finally allowed himself to cry, to let out the pain he had been holding inside for so long. And for the first time, Emma saw the possibility of hope in his eyes. The breakthrough wasn't immediate, but it was real. Mike began attending the group sessions, opening up slowly, piece by piece. He wasn't cured. There was no quick fix for the kind of wounds he carried, but he was starting to heal. And that was more than Emma could have hoped for. As the weeks passed, Mike made progress. He still had his bad days, but they were fewer and farther between. He started to talk more, not just with Emma and David, but with the other veterans at the center. Slowly, he was rebuilding his life, one step at a time. But just when it seemed like things were turning around, a new challenge emerged, one that neither Emma nor Mike saw coming. Just when Mike seemed to be finding his footing, the news came, news that threatened to undo all the progress he had made. The rehabilitation center, the one place where Mike had finally begun to feel safe, was in danger of closing. Funding had been cut, and without immediate intervention, the center would have to shut its doors in just a few months. Emma was the first to hear the devastating news. She received a call from the center's director early one morning, and the words hit her like a punch to the gut. The center had become a lifeline for Mike, for so many veterans, and now it was slipping away. Sitting at her kitchen table, Emma stared down at her phone, her mind racing. She had fought so hard to get Mike to this point, to help him see that he wasn't alone in his battle. If the center closed, where would that leave him? Could he handle the sudden loss of support, the return to uncertainty? She knew the answer without even asking. Later that afternoon, Emma visited Mike at the center, her heart heavy with the news she had to deliver. She found him in the garden, where he often went to clear his mind. He was tending to the small patch of flowers he had planted, a part of his healing process, the staff had said. Gardening was a way for veterans to reconnect with life, to care for something fragile and see it grow. Emma hesitated for a moment, watching him, before finally stepping forward. "Mike," she said softly, her voice betraying her concern. He turned to face her, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" he asked, reading the tension in her voice. She sat down beside him, taking a deep breath. "The center, it's in trouble. They've lost their funding, and they might have to close in a few months." The silence that followed was crushing. Mike didn't say anything at first, his face unreadable, but Emma could see the storm brewing behind his eyes. She waited, knowing that he needed a moment to process. "I knew it was too good to last," Mike finally muttered, his voice bitter. "Nothing ever stays, does it?" Emma reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "That's not true. We're not giving up yet. There's still time to find a solution." But Mike shook his head. "I've seen this before. Places like this, they don't survive, and people like me, we don't either." Over the next few days, Emma and David worked tirelessly, reaching out to everyone they knew who might be able to help. They organized meetings, called local officials, and even set up an online fundraiser. But the clock was ticking, and the amount they needed seemed insurmountable. With every passing day, the reality of the center's closure loomed larger, and Mike began to retreat into himself again. One evening, as Emma sat with her father at the kitchen table, poring over spreadsheets and donation tallies, she felt a sense of helplessness wash over her. They had come so far, but it still wasn't enough. "What if we can't save it?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "What happens to Mike then?" David sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We'll figure something out," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. Just as Emma was about to respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was an email from a national veterans organization, one she had contacted weeks ago but hadn't heard back from. Her hands shook as she opened the message, her heart pounding in her chest. "Dad," she said, her voice trembling. "They want to help. They're offering a grant." The next morning, Emma rushed to the center, her heart racing with hope. She found Mike in his usual spot, sitting in the garden. This time, though, there was a heaviness to his posture, a weariness that hadn't been there before. He was slipping back into the shadows, and Emma knew that time was running out, not just for the center, but for Mike's fragile sense of hope. "I've got news," Emma said, her voice breathless with excitement. Mike looked up, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "What is it?" "We're getting a grant, a big one. It's enough to keep the center open," she said, her words rushing out. "We did it, Mike. We're going to save this place." For a moment, Mike just stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "It's not just about the center," he said quietly. "It's me. I don't know if I can do this anymore." Emma felt a pang of fear in her chest. "What do you mean?" "I'm grateful for everything you've done," Mike continued, his voice low. "But I don't think I belong here. I don't know how to be normal. I've spent so many years lost, and I don't think I can find my way back." Emma knelt in front of him, her eyes pleading. "You're not lost anymore, Mike. You've come so far. Don't let all of this go. You deserve to be here, to heal, to live." For a long moment, there was only silence. Then Mike looked away, his jaw tight. "Maybe you're right," he whispered. "Maybe I just need more time." In the weeks that followed, the center began to transform. With the grant money, they were able to expand their services, bringing in more staff, more programs for veterans like Mike. And slowly but surely, Mike began to come out of his shell. He started attending group sessions more regularly, even helping some of the newer veterans who came through the doors. But the true turning point came one afternoon when Emma found Mike standing in front of a group of veterans, sharing his story for the first time. His voice was steady, his words raw with emotion, but there was strength in his vulnerability. "I spent a long time running from my past," Mike said, his gaze sweeping the room. "But I've learned that you can't outrun it. You have to face it, no matter how hard it is, and you don't have to do it alone." The room was silent, but the weight of Mike's words hung heavy in the air. Emma felt a swell of pride in her chest as she watched him. This was the man she had always believed in, the man who had fought through so much darkness to find his way back to the light. A few months later, Emma stood in the garden, watching as Mike tended to the flowers he had planted. The center was thriving now, a place of hope and healing for veterans across the city. And Mike, he had found a purpose again. He was still healing, still carrying the weight of his past, but he wasn't alone anymore. "You did it," Emma said softly, approaching him. Mike looked up, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I couldn't have done it without you." Emma smiled back, her heart full. "You did it because you're stronger than you think." As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the garden, Emma felt a deep sense of peace. She had helped save the center, but more importantly, she had helped save Mike, and in doing so, she had found her own strength, a strength she hadn't realized she possessed until now. If you enjoyed this powerful story of resilience and hope, please subscribe to Herokind Stories to stay updated on more inspiring tales. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's always a way back to the light. And before you go, don't miss our next video appearing on the screen now. It's another story of an ordinary person who made an extraordinary impact. Click on it and continue your journey with us.